Hey, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, my research trail crossed with one of the preeminent Civil War uniform researchers, and that is the late Michael J. McAfee. Mike was a curator for many years at West Point. He was also the author of a long-running column in Military Images magazine called Uniforms in History. This morning, as I was searching for information about a particular uniform, I stumbled upon Mike's column, the November-December 1993 column. And he starts out by talking about the challenges that a researcher faces when they are trying to identify the uniform worn by a soldier in a photograph. And typically, the soldiers are not identified in the images that Mike is searching. So I want to read you the beginning of the column, but before I do that, I just want to give you a quick glance. Here's the original, or a digital version of that original column as it appeared in our November-December 1993 issue. So he starts out by stating, as a museum curator, I frequently receive inquiries from neophyte researchers concerning uniforms worn by specific regiments. If these individuals are inexperienced, they appear to believe that one can go to a file cabinet and retrieve the regimental file wherein some obliging scribe of 1861 made note of every detail of the unit's dress and equipage. Perhaps nowadays they expect a computer printout of the latest data from a common research network. Mike goes on. Those of us who have been at it since the pad and pencil days of the 1950s know that no one specifically recorded this information back in the 1860s. To reconstruct the Civil War uniform, one must assemble many bits and pieces. For instance, a newspaper description may be coupled with a photograph to arrive at a fairly complete picture of a uniform. More often, the pieces of evidence remain disjointed, never coalescing into a meaningful pattern. And so there we have Mike's take on identifying uniforms, specifically the challenges of identifying uniforms. So interpreting all of what Mike just said, he's really talking about the challenges around the documentation of uniforms of that period. As Mike pretty much flat out says, they're not well documented. And there's a bunch of reasons that are the cause of it. Mainly, at that point in history, the idea of standardization, what we think of as standardization today, is not the same as standardization in 1861. The federal government put out guidelines about what a uniform should look like, and those guidelines were in text form. They were fairly general. The specific details were left to contractors in various towns and cities in different regions of the country. Those contractors interpreted the designs in their own way, generally following the rules, but the result would often be different looks. And then, of course, depending upon where you lived in the country and the whims of your commanding officers, your local townsfolks, and everybody else, you could customize those uniforms in different ways. Maybe you wanted to add a little bit of trim. Maybe you wanted to pick up on the latest Zubov style. Maybe you wanted to add a embellishment or a flourish to your cap or your hat. These details were left to individual companies and regiments, they were tolerated by the military. This idea of customization is not something that we know about today, so or we know quite as much about today. The standardization of the 1860s is not at all what it is today. Customization was way bigger in the 1860s than it is now. So there's sort of a yin-yang thing going on there. So in order to really appreciate Civil War uniform identification, as Mike is talking about, you have to get yourself in the mindset of the 1860s. Very little documentation, standardization with a lowercase s, and customization with a capital C. That's what Civil War uniforms are all about. So what Mike said in 1993, the challenges, they're all still there, which means that the job of researchers to find out what those uniforms were all about is still very much present. The good news in all this is because of the digital age that we live in, so much more information is available at our fingertips. Also, since Mike's time, so many researchers have advanced the work that he did and the work that others did in the 1950s and 60s, so that we know a whole lot more about Civil War uniforms today than we did 40, 50 years ago. That having been said, still much more to learn, so get out there and fight the good fight. Until the next episode, happy trails.